There is a specific kind of betrayal that courts across 6 countries have spent the last 90 years trying to make sense of. Not the kind that happens between strangers, the kind that happens at a kitchen table, in a family home, between people who share a last name and a history, and in some cases the same blood. The 10 cases in this video share one thing across all the differences in how they unfolded, and where they happened, and how much money was involved. In every single one, someone decided that the person standing between them and an inheritance was the problem to be solved. 2 took place in the last decade. One happened in 1933 Paris. The rest fall in between. Some were planned across months. Some erupted in a single afternoon. Some involved hired help. Some did not. All of them started the same way: a family, a death, and someone who thought they were going to benefit from it. Section 1. Jennifer Pan, the daughter who faked her entire life. Jennifer Pan grew up in Markham, Ontario, a suburb just north of Toronto. Her parents, Han and Bic Ha Pan, had come to Canada from Vietnam. They worked hard, they saved money, they bought a house, and they had one goal above everything else: that their children would succeed in ways they never got the chance to. Jennifer was their oldest, and from the outside, she was doing exactly what they hoped. She took piano lessons for years and became genuinely talented. She was a competitive figure skater. She got decent grades. She was polite, soft-spoken, and obedient in the way her parents expected. To anyone looking at the Pan family from the outside, the picture was clean. Hard-working immigrant parents, accomplished daughter, the kind of family people point to as an example. But Jennifer was living 2 separate lives, and she had been for years. The first crack appeared in high school. Jennifer was dating a boy named Daniel Wong, and her parents did not approve. He was not ambitious enough. He was not the kind of future they had mapped out for their daughter. They told her to end it. She told them she did. She did not end it. She kept seeing Daniel in secret, while pretending to obey her parents at home. That gap, between what her parents believed and what was actually true, became the foundation her entire double life was built on. Then came the grades. In her final year of high school, Jennifer failed a required course. It was a quiet, private failure, the kind that could have been addressed honestly if the relationship between her and her parents allowed for that. It did not. Han and Bic Ha had extremely high expectations, and Jennifer had learned early that disappointing them came with serious consequences. So instead of telling them the truth, she lied. She told them she passed. That single lie required more lies to hold it up. She told her parents she had been accepted to the University of Toronto to study pharmacology. She had not applied. She had not been accepted anywhere. But her parents believed her, and the lie grew. For the next several years, Jennifer Pan pretended to be a university student. She left the house every weekday. She dressed like a student. She talked about her classes. On the days she was supposed to be in lecture halls, she was sitting in coffee shops, teaching piano lessons to children in the neighbourhood, and working shifts at a local restaurant. She had a student ID card made to support the lie. She constructed fake report cards. She kept the deception going for so long that it became, in a practical sense, her actual life. She also moved out, telling her parents she was staying near campus during the week to make her commute to university easier. In reality, she was living with Daniel Wong, the boyfriend her parents still believed she had stopped seeing years earlier. Daniel was working. He managed a Boston pizza location and sold marijuana on the side. He and Jennifer had built a small, ordinary life together. But that life could never be acknowledged. Her parents could never know he existed, or that Jennifer was living with him, or that the university career they were so proud of was entirely fabricated. The lie ran for roughly 7 years. Then it collapsed. Bic Ha Pan grew suspicious when Jennifer mentioned she had taken a volunteer position at the Hospital for Sick Children, one of the most well-known hospitals in Canada. It was the kind of achievement that sounded exactly right for a pharmacology student building her resume. But when Bic Ha asked to see Jennifer's hospital ID badge and uniform, Jennifer could not produce them. Then Bic Ha followed her daughter to the hospital one day. Jennifer did not work there. She had never worked there. She did not even know anyone who worked there. Bic Ha told Han. Everything came out. the university degree that did not exist, the boyfriend who had never gone away, the years of constructed lies about grades, classes, exams, internships, and volunteer work. All of it gone. Han Pan was furious. He wanted to remove Jennifer from the family home immediately. Bitch Ha convinced him to let her stay, and they began putting new restrictions on Jennifer's life. No more leaving during the week, no more contact with Daniel, a return to the controlled household routine she had grown up under. Jennifer was 24 years old at this point. She had no degree, no real career, and a relationship she could not acknowledge. The life she had quietly built for herself was being dismantled piece by piece. And rather than finding a way to start over honestly, which would have been painful but survivable, Jennifer Pan began planning something else entirely. She wanted her parents gone. Not both of them, according to some accounts. Early versions of the plan focused on her father, who was seen as the stricter of the two parents and the one pushing hardest to end Jennifer's relationship with Daniel. Jennifer reached out through Daniel's connections, looking for someone willing to harm Han Pan. One contact turned her down outright. Eventually, through Daniel and his associates, Jennifer connected with three men: Lenford Crawford, David Milvaganam, and Eric Carty. The plan evolved from targeting just her father to targeting both parents. The goal, as prosecutors later argued, was to collect the family home and a life insurance payout. Jennifer made a partial payment up front and promised the remainder once the inheritance came through. On the evening of November 8, 2010, Jennifer's parents were home. Han went to bed early, as he usually did. Bitch Ha came home from her weekly line dancing class and spoke briefly with Jennifer. At some point that night, the three hired men entered the Pan family home. What followed was presented in court as a staged home invasion. The men were let in, and what Jennifer told police afterward was that she had heard noise, gone downstairs, and been confronted by intruders who tied her to the staircase railing and forced her to give them the location of the family's valuables. She said the men had taken her parents upstairs and she had heard gunshots. Bik Ha Pan was shot in the head. She passed away at the scene. Han Pan was also shot. The bullet entered near his eye. He survived, though his recovery was long and serious. Jennifer called 911 screaming. Police arrived and found her tied at the staircase just as she had described. The scene looked, on the surface, exactly like a home invasion gone tragically wrong. But things did not add up. The first thing investigators noticed was that Jennifer had not been harmed. In a violent home invasion where the perpetrators were willing to shoot two people, the daughter had been left alive, tied to a railing, completely uninjured. That was unusual. The second thing that stood out was Jennifer's emotional state, not in the immediate aftermath, when she was distressed, but in the days and weeks that followed. There were moments that felt rehearsed, details in her account that shifted slightly. Then Han Pan woke up. He was in the hospital, recovering from a gunshot wound to the face. When investigators came to speak with him, he told them something that changed the entire investigation. He remembered, through the chaos of that night, seeing his daughter and one of the men standing close together. He said their exchange looked familiar, not threatening, not the interaction of a victim and an intruder. He said it looked like they knew each other. Police began pulling phone records. What they found was a pattern of calls between Jennifer Pan and Daniel Wong, and between Wong and the men who had entered the house that night. The calls formed a clear chain connecting Jennifer to the attack on her own family. Further investigation revealed the payments that had already been made, and the promise of more money once Jennifer collected what her parents had left behind. Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, and David Milvaganam were arrested. Eric Carty was also later charged with conspiracy. The trial ran in 2014. It lasted months. Jennifer took the stand and maintained she was a victim. The jury did not believe her. In December 2014, all four main defendants were found responsible on the most serious charges and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The case became one of the most closely followed true crime stories in Canadian history, not because the facts were especially difficult to establish. They were not, once the phone records and financial trail were assembled, but because of the sheer scale of the deception that preceded the attack. 7 years of lies. a constructed identity held together with fake documents and daily performance. A family that genuinely believed in their daughter and had no idea what she had built in the space between what she showed them and what she actually was. There is something else about this case that rarely gets discussed in the same breath as the legal outcome. Hampan survived. He testified at trial against his own daughter. He sat in a courtroom and told a jury what he had seen through the haze of a gunshot wound. His daughter, standing close to one of the men who had just taken his wife's life, exchanging words with him in a way that looked nothing like fear. He had believed in her. He had strict standards, yes. His parenting style was controlling in ways that are documented throughout the trial record. But he had believed the person he was raising. He had let her stay in the house when everything came out because Bikha asked him to. And his wife paid for that with her life. Bikha Pan had protected Jennifer when Han wanted to throw her out. She had been the softer parent, the one who pushed for the family to stay together even after the lies were discovered. She came home from line dancing and walked into a house where 3 men were waiting. She passed away in her own home. The inheritance angle in this case is more complicated than a straightforward financial motive. Jennifer was not about to receive a large estate. The Pan family was comfortable, but not wealthy. The house in Markham and a life insurance policy were the primary assets. What the case is really about, when you sit with it, is someone who had built an entire false identity over 7 years and faced the moment when that identity was going to be stripped away completely. The financial motive existed. The prosecutors proved it. But underneath that motive was a person who had never learned to face the consequences of her own decisions and who reached for the most extreme possible solution when those consequences finally arrived. In March 2026, following a Supreme Court of Canada ruling that ordered a new trial on the most serious charge due to a jury instruction error, not because the facts were in dispute, Jennifer Pan pleaded responsible for the lesser charge. She is still serving a life sentence. She is now eligible for parole where she was not before, but she remains in custody. Bikha Pan was 57 years old. She had worked her entire adult life. She had a daughter she fought to keep in her home, even when her husband wanted her gone. She went to line dancing on Wednesday nights. She never came home from the last one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case begins with a luxury resort, a fruit bowl, and a suitcase that seemed far too small for what was inside it. What makes it different from Jennifer Pan's story is not the money, the amount was larger, but the brazenness. No elaborate deception, no years of build-up. This one happened in 4 days on a tropical island, and the photographs from the scene ended up on the front pages of newspapers across 3 continents. Section 2. Heather Mack, the suitcase in Bali. Sheila von Wies Mack was 62 years old and wealthy. She had a daughter named Heather, a boyfriend of that daughter named Tommy Schaefer, and a $1.5 million trust fund that her late husband had set up before he passed away. Those 4 facts, combined with a vacation to one of the most beautiful islands on Earth, produced a crime scene that photographs from hotels and police reports sent across the world in August 2014. To understand what happened in that hotel room, you have to understand what the relationship between Sheila and Heather actually looked like before it ended. It was not good. Heather Mack grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb just west of Chicago. Her father, Steve Mack, was a music producer who had worked with some well-known names in the industry. He passed away in 2006 when Heather was 10 years old. He left behind an estate, and in his will, he named Heather as the sole beneficiary of a trust fund worth roughly $1.5 million. Sheila, his wife, was named the executor of that estate. That arrangement became the source of ongoing conflict between mother and daughter. By the time Heather was a teenager, the relationship had deteriorated badly enough that police were called to the family home in Oak Park dozens of times. The calls were documented. There were reports of physical altercations. Neighbours knew the address. The local police knew the address. The dysfunction between Sheila and Heather was not a private behind closed doors problem. It was loud, repeated, and well recorded. Heather later claimed in written communications to a court that her mother had misled a judge years earlier in order to take control of the trust fund that was supposed to belong to Heather. She alleged that Sheila had positioned herself as the sole beneficiary of the estate, rather than simply its manager, and that money Heather's father intended for his daughter had been redirected. Whether or not those allegations were accurate, they were part of how Heather understood her situation, that her mother was standing between her and money that was rightfully hers. By 2014, Heather was 18 years old, pregnant, and in a relationship with Tommy Schaefer, who was 21. Schaefer had a cousin named Robert Bibbs. That detail becomes relevant shortly. In August of that year, Sheila took Heather and Tommy on vacation to Bali. The destination was the St. Regis Bali Resort, one of the most expensive hotels on the island, the kind of place where rooms cost several $100s a night, and the service is the sort that leaves nothing to chance. Whatever else was going on in the relationship between Sheila and her daughter, they were travelling in comfort. The trip did not last long before things became violent. On the night of August 11th, 2014, something happened in the hotel room. The official account, established through the Indonesian court proceedings, is that Tommy Schaefer attacked Sheila von Wiesmack with a metal fruit bowl, the kind of decorative fruit bowl that luxury hotels leave in rooms as part of the welcome arrangement. He struck her repeatedly. Heather, according to prosecutors, held her hand over her mother's mouth during the attack to keep her from screaming or calling for help. Sheila died from her injuries in that hotel room. What happened next became the detail that turned this from a regional crime story into an international one. Heather and Tommy needed to get rid of the body. They looked at what was available in the room. There was a large suitcase, the kind travellers bring to resort destinations when they are packing for an extended stay. They forced Sheila's body into the suitcase, closed it, and arranged to have it taken outside. The suitcase was then placed in the trunk of a taxi that was waiting near the hotel entrance. The photographs of that suitcase, taken by Indonesian police at the scene, were published across the world. The suitcase looked far too small to contain an adult human body. The image was disturbing in a very specific and visual way that text descriptions cannot fully capture. The idea that someone had forced another person into that space, that the act of concealment had required physical effort and deliberateness. Those photographs ran on front pages and websites in the United States, Europe, and across Asia. The case became global within 48 hours. A hotel taxi driver noticed something was wrong and contacted the resort. The body was discovered on August 12, 2014, one day after the attack. Heather and Tommy were still on the island. They were arrested the following day at a hotel, approximately 6 miles from the St. Regis. When they were taken in, Heather was visibly pregnant. The initial story they gave Indonesian authorities was self-defense. They told police that Sheila had attacked Tommy after he and Heather told her about the pregnancy, that Sheila had become enraged at the news of her daughter expecting a child with this particular man, and that the violence had been defensive. The claim did not hold up. Indonesian authorities investigated thoroughly. The evidence in the hotel room, the nature of the injuries, and the subsequent attempt to conceal the body all pointed away from a spontaneous defensive incident and towards something planned, or at minimum, deliberately carried out. The fruit bowl used in the attack had been taken from the room's decorative arrangement. The suitcase had been deliberately packed. A taxi had been arranged. These were not the actions of people in shock who had just defended themselves. The investigation also extended to the United States, where the FBI had been looking into the background of the case. What emerged from that American investigation was the involvement of Robert Bibbs, Tommy Schaefer's cousin. Bibbs, who was based in the US, was found to have been involved in helping plan the attack. The arrangement, as established through legal proceedings, was that Bibbs would receive $50,000 from the inheritance money Heather expected to collect after her mother's passing. He had agreed to participate in planning for a financial cut of the outcome. Bibbs pleaded responsible in 2016 in an American court and received a 9-year prison sentence. Heather gave birth to a daughter named Stella while she was in custody in Indonesia before her trial. She was photographed holding the baby in her prison cell, and those images also circulated widely. The Indonesian trial ran in early 2015. Both Heather and Tommy maintained versions of their account throughout. Tommy was convicted of premeditated harm causing passing and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Heather was convicted of assisting in the act, specifically for covering her mother's mouth during the attack, and sentenced to 10 years. The sentences drew comment from many people who followed the case. Tommy, who had carried out the physical attack, received 18 years. Heather, convicted as an accessory, received 10. Both sentences were under Indonesian law, which operates differently from American law in how it structures these charges. Heather served her time at Kerobokan Prison, a facility in Bali that had become well known internationally over the years for housing foreign nationals convicted on the island. She received sentence reductions on Indonesian national holidays, a standard practice in the Indonesian prison system where reductions are granted to prisoners who meet behavioural criteria. After 7 years and several months, having accumulated a total of 34 months in reductions, she was released and deported to the United States in October 2021. The FBI was waiting. Federal agents took Heather Mack into custody the moment she landed at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. A federal indictment had been prepared and was unsealed that day. The charge was conspiracy to take the life of a United States national abroad, a federal crime that the US government can prosecute regardless of where the act took place, because the victim was an American citizen. Tommy Schaefer, still serving his sentence in Indonesia, was also named in the federal indictment. Heather pleaded not responsible initially and was held in federal custody in Chicago while the case proceeded. Negotiations between her legal team and federal prosecutors ran for several months. In June 2023, Heather Mack appeared before US District Judge Matthew Kennelly in Chicago Federal Court. She was 27 years old. She was wearing orange jail clothing. The judge walked through the charge, conspiracy to take the life of a US national, and asked if she understood what she was giving up by changing her plea. She responded clearly and calmly to each of his questions. She pleaded responsible. The plea agreement that her attorneys had negotiated with federal prosecutors called for a sentence of no more than 28 years in American federal prison. Sentencing was scheduled for later that year. The financial picture in this case has a particular irony to it. The $1.5 million trust fund that formed the motive for the entire series of events, the money Heather's father had set aside for her, the money her mother had been managing, the money that sat at the centre of years of conflict between them, became largely inaccessible to Heather as a result of what happened. Standard American legal principles prevent someone from financially benefiting from the passing of a person they were involved in harming. The trust went through extended litigation. Heather's uncle, who served as trustee, argued she should be barred from receiving any portion of it. About a third of the remaining trust had already been spent on legal fees and investment losses by the time the civil proceedings were underway. Heather at one point indicated she and Tommy would drop their claim to the remaining amount, so it could pass to their daughter Stella instead. Stella Schaefer, born in an Indonesian prison cell, was raised by others while her mother served out her sentence overseas. There are two separate things happening in this case that are worth sitting with separately. The first is the financial motive. It is clear and it is documented. The trust fund existed. The conflict over who controlled it had been ongoing for years before the Bali trip. Robert Bibbs had a specific dollar amount attached to his involvement. This was not a spontaneous moment of violence. There were other people who knew what was being planned and had financial stakes in the outcome. The second is the texture of the relationship between Heather and her mother. The Oak Park police calls, the repeated physical conflicts over years, the legal battle over the trust, the fact that Sheila took Heather and her boyfriend on a luxury vacation to Bali, while simultaneously being the target of their planning. There is something genuinely disorienting about that proximity. They were sharing meals at a 5-star resort. They were on the same island, in the same room. Whatever Heather had decided by that point, she was still there, still present, still going through the daily motions of a family trip. Sheila von Wiesmack was 62 years old. She had raised a daughter alone after her husband passed away when Heather was 10. That daughter had a complicated childhood, a difficult adolescence, and a relationship with a man her mother apparently did not approve of. Whatever failures existed in that family dynamic, and there were clearly failures on multiple sides, Sheila did not deserve to pass away in a hotel room on a vacation she had paid for, in a suitcase, in the trunk of a car, on an island she had brought her daughter to. The suitcase photographs still exist. They still circulate when the case is discussed. They are a particular kind of reminder that what happened in that room was not impulsive in its aftermath, even if arguments could be made about the moments that preceded it. Someone made the decision to pack a body into luggage and arrange for its removal. That decision did not come from panic. It came from calculation. Heather Mack is currently serving time in federal custody in the United States. Tommy Schaefer remains in Indonesia. Their daughter Stella, now around 10 years old, lives apart from both of them. The inheritance her grandfather meant for her to have is tied up in proceedings that have outlasted the original case by nearly a decade. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from hired help and secret boyfriends entirely. The woman at the centre of it did not use an intermediary, did not need a weapon brought from outside, and did not leave the country. She sat in a Texas suburb with a plan that had been building for months, and she brought other teenagers into it. What makes it stand apart is not just how it ended, it is how carefully it was constructed before it began, and who was doing the constructing. Section 3. Chelsea Richardson, the plan that started at an IHOP. Mansfield, Texas, is about 20 miles southeast of Fort Worth. In 2003, it was a quiet, well-off suburb, the kind of place where people had big houses with two-car garages, kids played in cul-de-sacs, and Christmas lights went up the first week of December. Rick and Susanna Wamsley lived in a neighbourhood called Walnut Estates. Their house was large, decorated for the holidays, and worth part of an estate that came to roughly $1.65 million when everything was added together, including a life insurance policy worth over $1 million on its own. Rick was 46. He had met Susanna when they were both students in Oklahoma, he at Oklahoma State University, she studying art at Oklahoma Christian College. They married, built a career together, and settled eventually in Mansfield, where Rick ran his own accounting practice out of their home, working in the oil and gas industry. Susanna managed the house and traded antiques on the side. Neighbours described her as someone who showed up at your door with a pie when you lost a family member, and who decorated for Christmas with the kind of thoroughness that became its own neighbourhood landmark. On December 9th, 2003, 2 days before she was found dead, a neighbour visited to see the finished Christmas tree. Susanna was in the middle of preparing for a neighbourhood holiday party. Rick had just snapped photographs of Susanna and their 3-year-old granddaughter, their daughter Sarah's child, unpacking ornaments together. They had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named Andrew. Andrew was 19 years old in 2003. He had graduated from Mansfield High School the previous year and enrolled briefly at Tarrant County College, where his parents had hoped he might eventually become a certified public accountant like his father. He skipped classes frequently, showed little interest in academic work, and dropped out in the fall of 2003. When his parents found out, they cut him off financially. No more money, no more support. The arrangement had been simple: stay in school and we take care of you. Leave school and you take care of yourself. Andrew did not take this well. In the period leading up to the cutoff, his relationship with his parents had already been deteriorating. There had been a domestic disturbance at the house in which he threw a video game at his father. He had quit a job at a mini golf course in Arlington. The removal of financial support left him without income, without clear direction, and increasingly resentful of the gap between the life he had been raised in and the one he was now facing. Chelsea Richardson had grown up in a poorer part of Tarrant County. Her background was working class, a clear contrast to the Wamsley household, and one that Rick and Susanna were aware of and reportedly unhappy about. Chelsea had attended Joe C. Bean High School in Everman, a suburb of Fort Worth on the other side of the county from Mansfield. She had no prior criminal record. She had been working as a labourer. Andrew had met Chelsea around late 2002 at an IHOP restaurant in Arlington. They started dating in January 2003. By the fall of that year, they were in a serious relationship, sharing a social circle that gathered regularly at that same IHOP, which was managed by a 24-year-old named Hilario Cardenas. After Andrew's parents cut him off, he was effectively living at the Richardson household, a house that one source who knew the group at the time described in court proceedings as run down and overcrowded. Susanna Toledano, Chelsea's friend and roommate, had also moved in after a falling out with her own mother. Chelsea and Susanna had been close since high school. They had taken out a page together in the Everman High School 2003 senior yearbook, featuring cartoon drawings and the mottos "Smile Now, Cry Later" and "Up to No Good." When Andrew's parents cut him off, the gap between what he had grown up with and what he now had access to became the main subject of his and Chelsea's conversations. He had grown up in a $1.65 million household. He was now a dropout with no income, a girlfriend his parents did not approve of, and no obvious path back to the life he had been raised in. Chelsea, by multiple accounts, was the more forceful personality in the relationship. Investigators and those who knew the group later described her as dominant and driven in a way Andrew was not. Andrew, in the assessment of people who understood the dynamic, was a weak-willed young man who was susceptible to being led. Chelsea was the one leading. By October 2003, 2 months before Christmas, they had started talking seriously about doing something about it. The plan they landed on was straightforward in its logic and brutal in its detail. If Rick and Susanna were gone, Andrew would inherit everything. The house, the savings, the insurance payout. All of it. And Chelsea, as his girlfriend, would share in that life. They recruited 2 people. The first was Hilario Cardenas, the IHOP manager. His role was practical. He was tasked with obtaining a firearm, which he did. The second recruit was Susanna Toledano, who was Chelsea's roommate and close friend. Susanna was also 19, worked in fast food, and had been living with Chelsea after the falling out with her own mother. She was the one they planned to have physically carry out the act, keeping Andrew and Chelsea at a distance from the direct violence. Later testimony indicated Susanna was reluctant. She was reportedly pressured into participation and told she had no real choice once the planning had progressed as far as it had. There was also a third target. The plan included Andrew's older sister Sarah, who would also stand to inherit if their parents passed away. If Sarah was eliminated as well, Andrew would receive everything without having to share. Sarah was not home on the night the plan was finally carried out, and she survived without ever knowing how close to the plan she had been. Before December, they tried twice and failed. The first attempt involved shooting at the gas tank of the Wamsley's Jeep Laredo on November 9, 2003, apparently in the hope that it would cause the vehicle to catch fire while Rick and Susanna were inside. Susanna fired at the gas tank. The Jeep did not explode. The attempt left no obvious connection to the group and went undetected. There was at least one other attempt that also did not succeed. By the time December arrived, they had settled on going directly into the house. On the night of December 11, 2003, Susanna Toledano entered the Wamsley home through the garage. What she found inside was a family home in the middle of an ordinary evening. Susanna was in the living room. Rick was elsewhere in the house. Susanna was shot in the ear and then stabbed more than 18 times. Rick was shot in the head and in the back and also stabbed multiple times. The final wound count for Rick was recorded at over 21 separate injuries. Court testimony and forensic evidence established that during the attack, Rick fought back. That fact became the break that would eventually unravel everything. Both Rick and Susanna Wamsley were 46 and 45 years old. They were found on the main floor of their own home. Rick was near the front door. Susanna was on the living room couch. They had been dead for somewhere between 8 and 12 hours by the time police arrived. The 911 call that brought police to the house was a silent one. The phone had been lifted and left off the hook without anyone speaking. Investigators later determined it was Andrew who made that call the following day, from outside the house. He had been eager for the bodies to be discovered, so the inheritance process could begin. He appears to have believed, at 19 years old, that the money would simply become available once his parents were declared dead. When police entered the house, they found no signs of forced entry, no robbery, nothing taken. The crime scene did not look like a break-in gone wrong. It looked like someone had come in specifically to do what they did and then left. The investigation went quiet for several months. The break came from Rick Wamsley's hands. In the process of fighting back, Rick had grabbed at his attacker. He was holding a clump of hair when police found him. That hair was collected and submitted for DNA testing. In April 2004, 4 months after the attack, the DNA results came back. The hair belonged to Susanna Toledano. Investigators tracked Toledano to a relative's home in Addison, Illinois, and arrested her there on April 4, 2004. Police brought Susanna in immediately. She was 19 and facing the possibility of a capital charge in Texas, which carried the death penalty. She broke. She told investigators everything: the planning, the group, the IHOP meetings, the failed earlier attempts, the roles each person had played. She gave them Chelsea Richardson, she gave them Andrew Wamsley, she gave them Hilario Cardenas. Chelsea and Andrew were arrested on April 7, 2004. Cardenas was also taken in. The legal proceedings that followed were spread over 2 years and produced 4 separate outcomes. Susana Toledano pleaded responsible to murder in January 2005 and agreed to testify against the others in exchange for avoiding a capital charge. She was sentenced in May 2006 to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She will be eligible for parole in 2034. Hilario Cardenas pleaded responsible to conspiracy to commit the act. He received a 50-year sentence in May 2006. He has been denied parole. Andrew Wamsley went to trial and was convicted of capital offence on March 5, 2006. The jury, however, did not conclude that he represented a future danger to society, a specific finding required under Texas law to impose the death penalty. He received a life sentence instead. He is being held at the John B. Connolly Unit in Kennedy, Texas. He will be eligible for parole in 2044. Chelsea Richardson's trial began in May 2005. Susana testified against her. 2 women who had been held in the same county jail also testified that Chelsea had spoken openly about her involvement while waiting for trial. The jury also heard that Chelsea had physically pushed Susana toward the living room during the attack to force her to act when Susana had hesitated. A jury found her responsible after about 3 hours of deliberation. On August 10, 2005, Chelsea Richardson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the first woman ever sent to death row in Tarrant County, Texas. She was 21 years old when she received that sentence. For 6 years, she remained on death row. She was one of 10 women on Texas's death row during that period. Then, in 2011, her attorney found something that changed everything. While reviewing the court transcript from Susana Toledano's testimony at Chelsea's trial, the attorney noticed that Susana had mentioned being interviewed by a psychologist before the proceedings. Those notes from that psychological interview had never been provided to Chelsea's defense team. When the attorney tracked down the psychologist and obtained the 11 pages of handwritten notes, what they contained was significant. Susana had told the psychologist that she was more personally responsible for what happened than either Chelsea or Andrew, that she knew what she was doing was wrong, and that she believed she could have prevented the whole thing but chose not to. That interview had existed during Chelsea's trial. The prosecution had access to it. Chelsea's lawyers had not been given it. Tarrant County prosecutors did not argue that the notes were irrelevant. They acknowledged the material had been withheld. Their position was that it would not have changed the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. A judge from another county was brought in to evaluate the appeal. That judge recommended a new punishment phase. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed and sent the case back to Tarrant County in November 2011. Chelsea's attorney was direct about his goal. He was not seeking to overturn the conviction, only to get her off death row. Prosecutors consulted with the victims' families, including Sarah Wamsley, the sister who had been on the group's target list but was not home that night, and reached an agreement. In early 2012, Chelsea Richardson was officially removed from death row and resentenced to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 40 years. There is a detail in this case that does not get enough attention. The plan included Sarah. She was on the list. The group wanted her gone as well, so that Andrew would receive the entire estate without a split. Sarah happened not to be home on December 11, 2003. That was not because anyone warned her or because she suspected anything. She was simply elsewhere that evening. Her parents were not. Sarah Wamsley lost both parents in one night. The sister who survived is, in the public record, described as having taken legal action after the convictions to ensure Andrew could not inherit anything from their parents' estate, which he could not, under the legal principle that prevents someone from benefiting from a crime they carried out. The estate did not go to Andrew, it went elsewhere in the family. Rick Wamsley was a father who had cut his son off for dropping out of college. That is a fairly ordinary parenting decision, the kind made in families across the country. The consequence in this case was a conspiracy that ended with his body found near the front door of his own home, with more than 20 stab wounds. Susana Wamsley had Christmas decorations up, A neighbour had visited 2 days earlier to admire the finished tree. She had a granddaughter she had been spending time with in the days before she passed away, photographed by Rick unpacking ornaments. She had been planning a neighbourhood holiday party. She went to line dancing and, by multiple accounts, was the kind of neighbour who arrived at your door with food when you needed it. Chelsea Richardson is currently serving a life sentence in a Texas state facility. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows this one looks completely different on the surface. There is no teenage boyfriend, no group planning sessions, no DNA found in a dead man's hands. What there is instead is a 53-year-old woman, an 85-year-old mother, a document that excluded one daughter from the family will, and a confrontation in a Florida apartment that lasted only a few minutes before everything was beyond fixing. What makes it different from everything covered so far is that the woman involved told the police exactly what she had done before her mother had even passed away. Section 4. Gabriela Pereiro, the daughter who confessed before her mother was gone. The call came in at 9:15 on a Thursday night in July 2018. Fort Lauderdale Fire Rescue received a report of an elderly woman having chest pains at a condo on Tennis Club Drive. Medics showed up expecting a cardiac situation. What they walked into was something else entirely. Luisa Pereiro, 85 years old, was lying in her bed. She had deep lacerations on the back of her head. The skin on both of her arms had been torn off in strips. She had bleeding on her brain. Her daughter, Gabriela, 53, was in the condo when the medics arrived, and she did not wait to be questioned. She started talking immediately. She told the medics she had attacked her mother. By the time Fort Lauderdale police officers arrived and the scene shifted from a medical call to a criminal one, Gabriela Pereiro had already laid out what happened with a level of detail that investigators rarely get at the scene of a violent incident. She kept talking. She talked to the medics. She talked to the first officers. She talked to detectives. The statements she gave that night, while her mother was still alive on life support, became the central evidence of the case. To understand how the evening of July 12, 2018 arrived at this point, you have to understand the arrangement that had been in place between Gabriela and her mother for some time before it. Luisa Pereiro was 85 and needed care. She lived in a condo in Fort Lauderdale and she had multiple children. One of them, Gabriela, had moved in with her or was staying with her temporarily, depending on which account you read. The nature of the arrangement was that Gabriela was present and helping manage her mother's daily life. She was the one physically there. She was the one showing up. The other siblings were not living with Luisa. They were elsewhere. At some point, Gabriela became aware of the contents of Luisa's will. What she learned was that her mother had decided to leave the inheritance to her other children, not to Gabriela. The woman who had given up her own living situation to care for an 85-year-old full-time, who was present every day while the other siblings were not, was going to receive nothing when her mother passed away. The money and whatever assets Luisa had were going to people who, from Gabriela's perspective, had not been there. Whether that characterization of the situation was fair, or whether there were reasons behind Luisa's decision that the public record does not capture, is something that only the family knows. What the record does capture is how Gabriela responded when she found out. On July 12, 2018, the dispute over the will came to a head inside the condo. Gabriela and Luisa argued about it. Gabriela described what happened next to the detectives herself, in her own words, without being pressed. She told them she became enraged. She started smashing things. She broke picture frames. She threw paperwork around the room. The rage was building rather than releasing, and she turned it toward her mother. She pushed Luisa to the floor. Then she grabbed her by the arms and, in her own description, ripped the skin off them. She grabbed her mother's neck with both hands and squeezed. Luisa was 85 years old and physically frail. She could not fight back. After it was over, Gabriela cleaned her mother up. She lifted her off the floor, carried or helped her into the bed, and made her presentable. Then she called for help, reporting an elderly woman with chest pains. That framing, chest pains instead of an assault, was the only part of the evening where Gabriela attempted any kind of concealment. Everything after the medics arrived, she reversed that concealment herself. She told the medics she had attacked her mother. She told the officers she had beaten her mother up. She told the detectives she pushed her down, grabbed her, and tore the skin off her arms. She also told them she had squeezed her neck. Sitting in the back of a police vehicle at some point during that night, officers overheard her saying aloud that her mother was leaving everything to her siblings and not to her, the one who had been caring for her. She was processing it out loud, to no one in particular, in the squad car with officers nearby. At one point she said plainly, "I guess I am going to jail. I beat up my mum." She also said, "I did it all. I do not want her to die." Those two things were both true. She had done it, and she did not appear to have set out with the intention of ending her mother's life. The attack was not calculated in the way that Jennifer Pan's plan or Chelsea Richardson's conspiracy had been calculated. There was no planning, no weapons acquired in advance, no hired help. The whole thing erupted in what appears to have been a sustained explosion of rage that lasted long enough to cause catastrophic injuries to a woman in her mid-80s. But the outcome was the same. Luisa Pereiro was taken to Broward Health Medical Center. She was in critical condition. At one point during her time in the emergency room, she was briefly declared deceased before medical staff were able to restore a pulse. She was placed on life support. She never regained consciousness. The following day, Friday, July 13, 2018, Luisa Pereiro passed away from her injuries. The cause was the injuries sustained in the attack, the brain bleed, the trauma, the damage done by the physical force applied to an elderly woman's body. The charge against Gabriella changed with her mother's passing. She had initially been charged with attempted battery when the outcome was uncertain. Once Luisa passed away, the charge became premeditated taking of a life and aggravated battery against a person 65 years of age or older. She was arrested, brought before a judge, and denied bond. She was arraigned on August 31, 2018. The premeditated charge is worth examining briefly because it raises a question that the evidence pulls in different directions. Premeditation, in Florida law, refers to a formed intent to end someone's life before the act is carried out. It does not have to be a long-standing plan, but it has to be a conscious decision made before the violence. Whether Gabriella's attack met that standard was the question the legal process was built to address. Prosecutors charged it as premeditated based on the sustained nature of the assault, the multiple phases of it, the choking, the decisions made during the attack. The fact that Gabriella cleaned her mother up afterward and called for help as a medical emergency, along with her repeated statements that she had not wanted her mother to die, complicated the premeditation picture. These are the details a defense would point to, but the prosecution's position was grounded in the severity and duration of what had actually been done to Luisa's body. Gabriella Pereiro remained in custody at Broward County Jail following the arraignment. No attorney had been listed on her jail records at the time of her arrest, and a public defender was appointed to represent her in the weeks that followed. The case was proceeding through the Broward County court system as of the last publicly available records. The final legal outcome, verdict, plea, or sentence, has not been confirmed in any publicly accessible record available at the time this was written. What is confirmed, in full, is the arrest, the charge, the arraignment, and every detail of what happened that night. All of it documented through police reports, the arrest affidavit, the arresting officer's sworn statement, and Gabriella Pereiro's own words spoken aloud at the scene. This case lands differently from the others covered so far. There was no conspiracy, no planning over months, no hired help, no boyfriend with financial motives. It was a 53-year-old woman and her 85-year-old mother in a condo in Fort Lauderdale, a will that excluded one of the children, and a conversation that turned violent before anyone could stop it. The element that makes it notable, beyond the violence itself, is the confession. Gabriella Pereiro did not attempt to construct a story. She did not lie to the medics or frame what they found as something other than what it was. She told them immediately. She kept telling people throughout that night, before her mother had even passed away, before the charge had been upgraded to its most serious form. Gabriella had already provided investigators with everything they needed. Whether that came from guilt, shock, an absence of self-preservation instinct in that moment, or something else entirely, is not something the police report answers. What the record shows is that a woman sat in the back of a police vehicle murmuring to herself about her mother's will, while her mother lay in a hospital bed 2 miles away on life support. Luisa Pereiro was 85 years old. She had lived long enough to need full-time care, long enough to require someone present every day. Her daughter had been that person. And in Luisa's final hours, the last things that happened to her were done by the same hands that had been taking care of her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to England, where a woman made far more deliberate choices. Not a single explosive night, but a methodical, months-long process that ended with an elderly woman burning alive in her own bed. The evidence that brought it all down was a camera mounted on a street she assumed nobody would notice, and a timeline so precise it left no explanation that fit the facts. Section 5. Karen Vamplew. The fire at Eaton Court. Newark is a market town in Nottinghamshire, England, about 120 miles north of London. It has a castle, a medieval market square, and streets of terraced houses that run in tight rows off the main roads. On one of those streets, King Street, a 44-year-old woman named Karen Vamplew lived with her husband Mark and their children in a rented home. A short distance away, on a quiet residential street called Eaton Court, Karen's mother-in-law, Elizabeth Vamplew, lived alone in a bungalow. Elizabeth was 77 years old. Her family knew her as Anne. She had a serious lung condition that required professional carers to visit her twice a day. She was deaf and wore hearing aids, though she took them out when she slept. She used a wheelchair and could not walk unaided. She was, by every measure, a vulnerable person who depended on the people around her to keep her safe. She was also, through the money she had accumulated over her lifetime, worth something when she died. Karen Vamplew had been positioned in Anne's life as a caring presence, a daughter-in-law who helped manage things, who had access to her home, who had a key and the entry code to the property, and who had been granted access to Anne's bank account. On paper, the arrangement looked like a family pulling together to support an elderly relative. Karen received a carer's allowance from the government for the role she played in Anne's life. What was actually happening with that bank account was something else entirely. Over a period of roughly 8 months, Karen Vamplew drained Anne's account from a balance of approximately £27,000 down to £105. The money came in regularly. Anne had a pension income that her carers described as healthy, more than enough to cover her living costs. The money went out consistently, drawn by Karen. By the time the account reached its near zero balance, Karen had spent the entire sum. Anne had no idea. Karen's husband Mark had no idea. Nobody knew except Karen. Then the bank stepped in. On December 14th, 2021, the day before the fire, Karen and Anne were seen together inside a branch of Santander in Newark. The bank had placed a limit of £5 on the account. That visit to the branch was the moment Karen understood that her access to Anne's money was finished. Whatever she had been using that money for, unpaid bills that had piled up, including an electricity bill of over £10,000, council tax, gas, mobile phone, and TV subscription arrears, she could no longer fund through Anne's account. The avenue was closed. That evening, professional carers visited Anne at her bungalow on Eaton Court as usual. They helped her to bed at around 5:45 in the evening and left at 6:30. Anne was settled for the night. She was in her bedroom, in her bed, without her hearing aids in the quiet of her small bungalow. In the early hours of December 15th, Karen Vamplew left her home on King Street. It was approximately 12:35 in the morning. Before she left, she turned off the location function on her mobile phone, a step that served no purpose if you were simply going to check on a relative, and every purpose if you did not want your movements logged. She got into her car and drove toward Eaton Court. CCTV cameras on nearby streets recorded her route. She did not park directly outside Anne's bungalow. She parked nearby, on a street close to Eaton Court, but not on it, wearing a hoodie. She walked to the bungalow. She had a key and the entry code. She went inside. Fire investigators later established that the fire in Anne's bedroom began at the bottom corner of the bed. The ignition point was consistent with a naked flame being applied directly to the bedding. It was not consistent with a cigarette being dropped or falling. The burn pattern was different, the location was wrong, and critically, the investigation found no smoking materials anywhere in the bedroom. Anne's smoking habit was well documented at trial. She smoked exclusively in the kitchen, by the open back door, and she extinguished her cigarettes under the sink tap. She put the butts in an empty chocolate buttons packet kept in the kitchen bin. There were no cigarettes in the bedroom. There never were. Karen Van Plu was seen on CCTV running back to her car at 1:13 in the morning. She drove home to King Street. 4 minutes after she arrived back at her own house, she got into her car again and drove back toward Eaton Court. At 1:25 in the morning, she called the emergency services to report the fire. The call she made to emergency services was examined at trial. In her account to police in the immediate aftermath, she said she had become worried about Anne because Anne had not called her that evening as she usually did. She said she went to check on her mother-in-law. She described pressing the lifeline alarm in the property and hearing Anne calling for help but being unable to reach her. She told officers in her first police interview that she and her husband had no debts, no credit cards, no outstanding bills, no financial problems. All of that was false. When the fire service arrived at Anne's bungalow, the fire had taken hold. Anne was rescued from the building, but she had already sustained severe burns and had inhaled significant amounts of smoke. She was taken to hospital. Elizabeth Ann Van Plu passed away later that same day, December 15th, 2021, from her injuries. Karen Van Plu was arrested on suspicion of the act 2 days after the fire, on December 17th, 2021. At that stage, police and fire investigators did not yet have sufficient evidence to charge her. She was questioned and released without charge. She went home. The investigation continued for nearly 2 years. The East Midlands Special Operations Unit, the regional serious crime team, worked with fire investigation experts, financial investigators, and medical specialists to build the case. A burns expert with a PhD in burns research and approximately 30 years of professional experience in the field was brought in to provide a detailed report on the injuries Anne had sustained, cross-referenced with the fire scene evidence. Fire investigators reconstructed the possible ignition sources. Tests were run on bedding material to compare the burn patterns produced by dropped cigarettes versus direct flame application. The results were clear. A cigarette could not have produced what was found in that bedroom. Karen Van Plu was rearrested on September 27, 2023, nearly 2 years after Anne's passing. She was charged with taking a life. She appeared at Nottingham Crown Court in October 2023 and pleaded not guilty. A trial date was set. The trial ran for 4 weeks at Leicester Crown Court in 2024. Karen maintained throughout that the fire had been started accidentally by Anne smoking in bed, a version that her own defence had to work hard to sustain, given that every piece of evidence about Anne's smoking habit placed it exclusively in the kitchen. Fire experts testified. The burns specialist testified. Financial investigators presented the evidence of the drained account. The CCTV footage was shown to the jury. It showed the timeline in exact detail. 12:35, she left home. She drove to Eaton Court. She was seen walking toward the bungalow. At 1:13, she was seen running back to her car. She drove home. 4 minutes later, she was in her car again. At 1:25, she reported the fire. The total absence of any credible reason to turn off her phone's location function before a welfare check on a relative was something the prosecution highlighted directly. Karen had a copy of Anne's will at her own home. That fact was introduced at trial. Karen's husband Mark had been kept completely in the dark about the debts his wife had accumulated and the money she had been drawing from his mother's account. The judge noted this explicitly at sentencing, stating that Mark was not aware of what his wife had been doing. On May 17, 2024, after weeks of hearing evidence, the jury at Leicester Crown Court found Karen Van Plu responsible on a single count of taking a life. There were audible gasps in the courtroom when the verdict was announced. 3 days later, on May 20th, Judge Timothy Spencer sentenced Karen Van Plu to life in prison. She would have to serve a minimum of 32 years before being considered for parole. He addressed her directly in court, and his words were reported in full by the local and national press. He told her that on December 15, 2021, she had entered the home of her mother-in-law while she was asleep and set fire to her bed. He described what Anne would have experienced: waking to find her bed already on fire, deaf without her hearing aids, unable to move without help, unable to call out in any meaningful way, confined in a burning room. He called it hell. He told Karen that by the time she carried out the act, she had come to regard Anne as a burden. He told her that in her thinking, she had believed that the money her husband would inherit from his mother's estate would smooth over the financial disaster she had created. The debts would be paid, the exploitation of Anne's account would be buried under the inheritance, and everything would be resolved. He described it as a killing for financial gain. The Crown Prosecution Service prosecutor summed it up plainly after sentencing. Karen Van Plu had been posing as a dutiful, caring relative. She had been drawing a carer's allowance for looking after the woman she eventually took the life of. She had depleted Anne's savings, and when that source of money was cut off, she treated her mother-in-law as the final remaining financial resource to be extracted. Elizabeth Van Plu, Anne, was described by her family after the verdict as a devoted mother, sister, grandmother, aunt, and friend to many people in Newark. She had been a cheery, bright presence in the town for decades before her health declined. She needed carers twice a day. She could not walk without help. She was deaf, and she had trusted the woman who entered her home in the middle of the night and set fire to the bed she was sleeping in. Karen Van Plu is serving her sentence. She will not be eligible for parole until she is in her mid-70s. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that comes next happened not in a small English town, but in 1930s Paris, and it is over 90 years old. What makes it worth including is not its age, but how precisely it mirrors the patterns in the cases that came before it. The financial desperation, the double life, the family member positioned as a trusted presence. The woman at the centre of it was 18 years old, and the French legal system condemned her to death before reversing course decades later in one of the most unusual legal outcomes in the history of European criminal law. Section 6. Violette Nozière, the scandal that shook 1930s Paris. The apartment at 9 Rue de Madagascar in Paris was small, a third-floor flat in a working-class neighbourhood in the 12th arrondissement, with walls close enough together that you could hear everything from every room. Jean-Baptiste Nozière worked as an engine driver on the French railways. His wife Germaine kept the home. Their daughter Violette was their only child, born January 11, 1915, and by all early accounts a bright girl with a promising path ahead of her. By the summer of 1933, Violette was 18 years old and living what amounted to two completely separate lives from within that single small apartment. The first life was the one her parents saw, a respectful, studious daughter who attended classes, stayed out of trouble, and fit the mould of what a young woman of modest Parisian family was supposed to be. She dressed neatly. She came home at the right times. She was the child Jean-Baptiste and Germaine had worked hard to provide for. The second life was the one they never saw. During the afternoons and evenings, Violette slipped away into the Latin Quarter, the busy bohemian district on the left bank of the Seine that was in the 1930s a centre of student life, bars, cafes, and social mixing between classes. There she dressed differently, spent money freely, and regularly exchanged sexual favours for payment from men she met. The money funded a lifestyle that her family's modest income could not have supported. Nice clothes, hotel rooms, expensive evenings. She had also contracted syphilis through this other life, and when her doctor became obligated to inform her parents, Violette's response was characteristic of how she handled problems. She found another doctor, persuaded him to certify that she was still a virgin, and told her parents that the disease must be hereditary, something the whole family must have been carrying unknowingly. Her parents believed her. The story was implausible on its face, but they trusted their daughter, and Violette was skilled at being trusted. It is worth noting that the test used to diagnose syphilis at that time was known to produce false positives, particularly in patients who had tuberculosis, which Violette did have. Whether she actually had syphilis is not entirely certain. What is certain is that she used the diagnosis, real or not, as a financial and social tool. Then she met Jean Dabin. Dabin was a gambler with a taste for things that cost money and a limited supply of his own. Violette fell for him and began supporting him, paying his debts, covering his expenses, financing the life he wanted to live. The money required to do this was considerably more than the combination of her allowance and her side earnings could generate. She needed a faster, larger source of funds. Her parents were the closest option available. On March 23, 1933, Violette bought a sleep-inducing drug called Sominal, a barbiturate, the kind of sedative that was legally available at the time in France. She told her parents that their family doctor had prescribed it to treat the hereditary syphilis she had convinced them they all shared. Both parents took it that evening. The dose was not sufficient. During the night, a fire broke out in the apartment. The circumstances of that fire were never fully explained, and both Jean-Baptiste and Germaine Nozière survived, suffering from smoke inhalation, but otherwise intact. Violette had failed. Her parents were still alive, and they still had no idea what their daughter had just tried to do to them. 5 months later, on August 21, 1933, Violette tried again. This time the dose was larger. She gave both parents the barbiturates in their evening drinks, framing it again as their prescribed medication. Then she left. She went to a hotel for the night, away from the apartment, giving the drugs time to work. When she returned, she found her parents motionless. She turned on the gas supply in the apartment. The intention appears to have been to make the scene look like a suicide by gas asphyxiation, redirecting the cause of death away from poisoning. Then she went to a neighbour's door and told them she could smell gas coming from the apartment and feared her parents had tried to end their lives. Jean-Baptiste Nozière was dead. The barbiturates had been fatal. Germaine Nozière had survived. The reason, established later, was that she had discarded part of her dose rather than drinking it fully. She was hospitalised and eventually recovered. Police were called. The suicide narrative did not hold up for long. Investigators found no notes, no indication of distress in the family, and the presence of barbiturate poisoning in both bodies pointed directly away from a gas asphyxiation. Violette was identified within days and taken into custody after what sources describe as a brief period on the run. She had been spending money at shops in Paris in the days after the incident, continuing to fund the lifestyle that had driven the whole series of events. The investigation moved quickly. Within days of her arrest, the full picture of Violette's double life emerged. The Latin Quarter evenings, the financial arrangement with Dabin, the medical deception about the syphilis, the March poisoning attempt that had gone wrong, and the August attempt that had not. The newspapers in Paris seized on every detail. France in 1933 was dealing with the economic pressures of the Depression years, political instability, and rising tensions across Europe. The Violette Nozière affair became the biggest private crime story the country had seen in years, discussed in every café, analysed in every newspaper, compared in its cultural weight to the Dreyfus affair of the 1890s. Part of what fueled the public obsession was the accusation Violette made during her legal proceedings. She claimed that her father had been sexually assaulting her since she was 12 years old. She stated that this was part of her motivation, that the man she had ended the life of had been abusing her for years, and that her mother had known and done nothing. This allegation divided France sharply. The mainstream press largely rejected it, treating it as a fabrication designed to generate sympathy and shift the focus of the trial. The conservative establishment viewed the claim as an attack on the institution of the family itself. Violette had not just taken the life of her father, she had attempted to destroy his reputation in the process. The death sentence handed down in October 1934 reflected, in part, how seriously the court viewed the totality of what she had done. But not everyone dismissed the allegation. The Surrealist movement, a group of avant-garde writers and artists then based primarily in Paris, published a collection of poems and artworks in December 1933, before the trial concluded, that took Violette's side explicitly. The collection included contributions from some of the most well-known artistic names in Europe at the time. It was immediately banned from distribution in France, which made it harder to obtain and therefore considerably more talked about. The Surrealists framed Violette not as a criminal, but as a figure rebelling against the suffocating constraints of the bourgeois family structure. There was also Superintendent Marcel Guillaume, the senior police investigator, who was among the first to take Violette's statement. He was a legendary figure in French law enforcement, later identified as one of the inspirations for Georges Simenon's fictional detective Maigret. Guillaume wrote in his memoirs that after hearing Violette's account directly, he personally believed her claim about her father. He was not the only official who did. Violette herself recanted the accusation in 1937 while still imprisoned. She withdrew the claim against her father entirely. That recantation is in the record. Whether it represented the truth, or whether it was made for other reasons, a desire to move on, pressure, changed circumstances, is something that cannot be established from the available evidence. The fact of the recantation is documented. The original claim is documented. What actually happened inside that apartment over the years is not. The legal outcome proceeded in stages over more than a decade. Violette was sentenced to death by guillotine on October 13, 1934. France had a convention of not executing women by guillotine, and her sentence was commuted to hard labour for life. In 1942, the sentence was reduced again to 12 years. She was released from prison on August 29, 1945, after serving approximately 12 years in total. In prison, she had worked diligently, eventually employed in the accounting department of the Rennes facility where she was held. After her release, she returned to Paris under her mother's name. Her mother, Germaine, the woman who had survived the poisoning, was alive and had reconciled with her daughter. They lived together. Violette eventually married and had 5 children. She and her mother ran a small hotel and restaurant near Rouen for a period of years. Germaine Nozière survived until September 5, 1968, outliving her daughter, who passed away from bone cancer on November 26, 1966. The 1953 effort by her longtime defence lawyer René de Vezine-Leroux succeeded in having her entire conviction overturned on procedural grounds. The technical, legal slate was cleared. In practice, this changed nothing about the facts of the case, which were never in serious dispute. Jean-Baptiste Nozière had been fatally harmed with barbiturates on August 21, 1933, and Violette had provided them. Director Claude Chabrol made a film about the case in 1978, with actress Isabelle Huppert in the lead role. The film competed at the Cannes Film Festival that year, where Huppert won the award for Best Actress. The New York Times later included it on its list of the best 1,000 films ever made. The case, more than 90 years after it happened, has never left French cultural memory. What connects it to the cases in this video is not the French legal system or the historical distance. It is the structure underneath it all. A young woman living 2 lives, one visible and presentable, one funded by methods her family could never know about. Money running out, a person in her immediate orbit who wanted more of it, parents who were the nearest available source, and a choice made to access that source permanently, rather than find another way. The financial motive was established and documented. Violette needed money for Jean de Bain. Her parents had what she needed. Every other layer of the case, the accusations, the surrealists, the newspaper war, the guillotine sentence, sits on top of that foundation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in Europe, but moves forward in time by nearly 9 decades, to England in 2021, and to a woman whose approach to the same basic problem was methodical in a way Violette Nozière's was not. Where Violette improvised across 2 attempts over 5 months, the woman in Section 7 spent the better part of a year draining an account down to almost nothing before she made her final move. And the evidence she left behind was so precise, in minutes and meters, that the jury had almost no room to land anywhere other than where they did. Section 7, Sarah Johnson. The morning everything fell apart in Bellevue. Bellevue, Idaho sits on the edge of Sun Valley, one of the most well-known resort areas in the American West. People with money have second homes in Sun Valley. The town of Bellevue, just south of it, is quieter and more residential. The kind of small Idaho city where families have lived for generations and where, by 2003, there had not been a single taking of a life in over a decade. Glen Aspen Drive is one of the nicer streets in Bellevue. The homes there are large, set back from the road, surrounded by cottonwood, pine and aspen trees that give the street its name. The Johnson family lived on Glen Aspen Drive in a house worth around $500,000. Diane Johnson was 52 years old and worked as a tax collector. Alan Johnson was 46 and co-owned Webb Landscape and Garden Centers. They had been together for 20 years. Their son Matt was away at the University of Idaho. Their daughter Sarah was 16, attended Wood River High School in the nearby town of Haley, and had been dating a 19-year-old named Bruno Santos for much of 2003. Alan and Diane did not approve of Bruno Santos. He was a high school dropout. He was suspected of involvement with illegal substances and had multiple minor substance-related offences. He was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, and he was pursuing an inappropriate relationship with their daughter, which under Idaho law created grounds for serious legal consequences. Alan Johnson had gone to Santos directly at some point and warned him to stay away from Sarah. He made clear that if the relationship continued, he would pursue legal action, which would almost certainly result in Santos being deported back to Mexico. Sarah had no intention of stopping the relationship. When her parents discovered she had been lying to them about her whereabouts in order to spend time with Santos, they took away her car. The household became tense in the way households with teenagers and serious disagreements tend to become tense. Repeated arguments, imposed restrictions, Sarah pushing back against rules she had no interest in following. Prosecutors later described the situation as Sarah developing a fantasy of marrying Santos and living off her parents' inheritance money. Whether that was an accurate characterization of her planning or a prosecutorial framing is debated. What is not debated is what happened on the morning of September 2, 2003. The Johnson family had a guest house attached to their property. A tenant named Mel Spiegel rented it. He had left for Boise the weekend before September 2nd and was not expected back for a week. In his closet, Spiegel kept a bolt-action hunting rifle, a .264 caliber Winchester Model 70, a powerful weapon designed for big game hunting. The closet was unlocked. Sarah had access to the guest house, knew Spiegel was away, and knew the rifle was in the closet. At approximately 6:20 in the morning on September 2nd, she went to the guest house and retrieved the rifle. Diane Johnson was asleep in the master bedroom when her daughter walked in and shot her in the head. She was still in bed. She never woke up. The sound of the rifle brought Alan out of the shower. He came out to find out what had happened. Sarah shot him twice in the chest. He was hit right above the heart. Both of her parents were dead. What happened next, in the roughly 40 minutes before police arrived, tells you a great deal about the state of mind Sarah was in during and after the act. She had come prepared with items designed to prevent physical evidence from being traced back to her. She had worn her pink bathrobe over her clothes during the shooting, wearing it backwards so the front of her body was protected from blood. She had worn gloves, a pair of leather gloves taken from her mother's SUV, along with a latex glove. She had worn a shower cap pulled down over her face, presumably to prevent blood spatter on her hair and face. After the shooting, she removed these items and attempted to get rid of them. The bathrobe, the gloves, and the rifle went into the garbage can outside the front of the house. The shower cap she flushed down the toilet. She placed kitchen knives around the crime scene, 2 on the floor near her parents' bed and 1 in her brother's room, in what appeared to be an attempt to suggest an intruder or some kind of staged scene. She then ran to her neighbour Kim Richards' house and told her that someone had shot her parents. The first responders who arrived sealed off the street. This turned out to be consequential. The local garbage truck was making its rounds that morning, and the sheriff stopped it from picking up the garbage can in front of the Johnson home. Everything Sarah had placed in that can was preserved as evidence. Sarah told police she had been asleep when she heard gunshots and had run to her parents' room to find them. Her story shifted in detail across multiple conversations with investigators. In some accounts, she said she heard one shot and then the other. In others, the sequence changed. She consistently maintained she was innocent and that an intruder had entered the home. The physical evidence told a different story. Inside the garbage can, investigators found the pink bathrobe covered in high-velocity blood spatter from both Diane and Alan. Inside the latex glove, they found Sarah's DNA. The leather glove had gunshot residue on the outside. The matching leather glove from the pair was found in Sarah's bedroom. 2 unfired .264 caliber rounds were found on the nightstand in Sarah's bedroom. A spent shell casing from a .264 rifle was found in the garage. Dried paint residue was found on the inside of the bathrobe. The t-shirt Sarah was wearing on the morning of the act had matching paint residue on it, the same paint, connecting the robe to what she had been wearing underneath it. The shower cap was recovered by plumbers from the toilet where Sarah had flushed it. Tests confirmed it could have been used to protect her hair and face from blood spatter. Crime scene investigator Rod Englert, who worked the case and later discussed it in a Forensic Files episode dedicated to the case, described the evidence trail in one phrase: the evidence was yelling and screaming. 1 month after the act, Sarah Johnson was arrested. The trial took place in March 2005, roughly 18 months after her parents were shot. Sarah was by then 18 years old. The trial ran for 5 weeks. The prosecution presented the full physical evidence chain. Her former boyfriend Bruno Santos testified, wanting to establish clearly that he had nothing to do with what happened. He had an alibi for the morning of September 2nd and was not at the Johnson home. His testimony was not designed to help Sarah, it was designed to separate himself from the events. Her brother Matt also testified. He described Sarah as someone who was dramatic and tended toward dishonesty when it suited her situation, but said he still loved her. One of the details the defense raised was the absence of blood spatter on Sarah's body when police arrived. This remained a point of contention across multiple appeals. The prosecution's position was that the bathrobe worn backwards, the shower cap, the gloves, and a quick wash-up afterward explained the absence. The fact that the shower cap had been flushed supported this. The prosecution framed the motive explicitly as financial. Prosecutors told the jury that Sarah wanted to marry her older boyfriend and live off her parents' money after their passing. The estate and inheritance from the Johnson family would have provided a significant sum. Sarah's defense lawyer, in a moment during the proceedings, noted the other side of that argument. Matt Johnson, Sarah's brother, would now receive Sarah's share of the parents' estate as well as his own, since Sarah could not benefit from the act. This was raised as a potential motive for Matt rather than Sarah, though investigators had cleared Matt entirely based on his whereabouts. On March 16, 2005, the jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree taking of a life. Sarah Johnson was convicted for the deaths of both her parents. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 years as a firearm enhancement under Idaho law. Prosecutors had chosen not to pursue the death penalty, specifically because Sarah had been 16 years old at the time. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld the conviction in 2008. In 2012, her legal team filed a petition for a new trial, arguing she had received inadequate legal representation at the original trial. They also pointed to the absence of blood spatter on Sarah and the fact that fingerprints found on the murder weapon belonged to Mel Spiegel, the guesthouse tenant, not to Sarah, whose prints were not found on the rifle. That request was denied in October 2014. In 2017, Sarah's legal team returned to court, arguing that her sentence of life without parole, imposed on someone who was 16 at the time, violated the 8th Amendment under the logic of a US Supreme Court ruling called Miller v. Alabama, which had found that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. The Idaho courts rejected this argument on the grounds that Sarah's sentence had been discretionary rather than mandatory. The judge had considered her youth and circumstances at sentencing, which satisfied the legal requirement. That ruling was affirmed. Further federal habeas appeals followed, and as of the most recent available legal records from 2024, the conviction and sentence continue to stand. Sarah Johnson remains confined at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Diane Johnson was 52 years old. She had been a tax collector and had spent 20 years with her husband building a life in Bellevue. She was shot in the head while she was asleep in her own bed at 6:20 in the morning. Alan Johnson was 46. He had worked hard enough at his landscaping business to co-own it. He came out of the shower to check on the sound of a rifle shot in his home and was shot twice in the chest by the person he had raised. The boyfriend they had tried to keep their daughter away from, the man whose deportation they had threatened, the man whose relationship with their daughter had triggered the entire chain of events, later ended up serving a 10-year sentence in Idaho for drug offences unrelated to their passing. The case has been featured on Forensic Files in an episode titled Disrobed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows this one is the only one in this entire video that began not with a daughter's rage or desperation, but with a long, systematic financial scheme that had already been running for years before anyone got hurt. The woman at the centre of it was acting as a caregiver, had been given access to her victim's most private financial records, and she used that access to drain everything within reach before the relationship turned fatal. Twice. Section 8. Stacey Caster, the Black Widow who turned on her own daughter. Weedsport is a small village in central New York, about 20 miles west of Syracuse. Quiet streets, modest homes, the kind of place where neighbours know each other's names and news travels fast. Stacey Daniels grew up nearby, in Clay, New York, and by the time she was 17 she had already met the man she would marry first, Michael Wallace. They married in 1988. 2 daughters followed, Ashley in 1987 and Bree in 1991. The family had little money. Michael and Stacey were young parents building a life in central New York that was ordinary in almost every visible way. By late 1999, Michael Wallace was sick. He had been sick for months. His family watched him deteriorate through the holiday season in ways that nobody could explain. He was dizzy. He could barely walk. He could not put sentences together clearly. Ashley, his daughter, later described watching him sit up suddenly and vomit across the coffee table and then lie back down as if nothing had happened. Michael told his doctors repeatedly that he felt drunk, that his body felt the way alcohol makes you feel, but he had not had anything to drink. The doctors could not determine what was wrong with him. Michael Wallace passed away on January 11, 2000. He was 38 years old. Doctors attributed his passing to a heart attack. His family had doubts. His sister pushed for an autopsy. Stacey said no. She told the family she trusted what the doctors had said and saw no reason to question it. Without an autopsy, Michael Wallace was buried. Stacey collected his life insurance policy. The payout was $55,000. 3 years later, in 2003, Stacey remarried. Her second husband was David Caster, who owned an air conditioning installation and repair business in the Syracuse area. Stacey worked as his office manager. They lived together in a home in the Syracuse suburb area. David had a son from a previous relationship, David Caster Jr. In August 2005, Stacey called emergency services. She told the dispatcher that her husband had locked himself in the bedroom and had not come out for 24 hours. When paramedics arrived, she asked them to break down the bedroom door. David Caster was found inside. He was dead. There was a glass of liquid on the nightstand beside his body. The medical examiner determined the cause of passing was antifreeze ingestion, ethylene glycol, the toxic compound in automotive antifreeze. The initial ruling was suicide. Investigators were not satisfied. The glass on the nightstand was tested for fingerprints. 3 fingerprints were found on it. All 3 belonged to Stacey Caster. None belonged to David. Investigators also found a kitchen turkey baster that had traces of David Caster's DNA on it, alongside traces of ethylene glycol. The theory that emerged from the physical evidence was specific. Stacey had drugged her husband to incapacitate him and then used the turkey baster to force antifreeze into his throat while he was unconscious. The scene had then been staged to look like David had chosen to end his life by drinking the liquid on purpose. During a police interview about David's passing, something else happened. Stacey made a verbal slip. When investigators were discussing the details of the case with her, she said aloud that she had poured him the antifreeze, and then stopped herself, corrected to say cranberry juice. When investigators pointed out what she had just said, she claims they had misheard her or confused her. When shown a photograph of the turkey baster, she terminated the interview immediately and refused to continue. The case was reclassified as a homicide. Investigators then turned their attention back to Michael Wallace, the first husband who had passed away 5 years earlier with no autopsy. His death had occurred in Cayuga County, a different jurisdiction from where David Caster had lived and worked. Getting permission to exhume Michael Wallace's body required coordination between 2 county systems and took nearly a year. The exhumation was carried out in September 2007 and done quietly. Investigators deliberately kept it from Stacey's knowledge to prevent interference. When forensic pathologists examined Michael Wallace's remains, they found crystals in his body consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning. Antifreeze leaves a chemical signature in tissue that does not fully disappear even years after passing. The cause of Michael Wallace's death in January 2000 was reclassified as homicide by antifreeze ingestion. 2 husbands, same substance, same woman at the centre. No autopsy requested for the first, and a scene staged to look like a voluntary act for the second. Within days of Michael Wallace's exhumation results, while investigators were still processing what they had found, Stacey made another 911 call. She said her daughter had taken some pills. Ashley Wallace, Stacey's older daughter, was found unconscious at the family home. She was 20 years old at the time. Emergency services arrived and transported her to hospital. Her condition was serious. Investigators who responded noted that alongside Ashley's unconscious body, there was a typed suicide note. In that note, Ashley confessed to having taken the life of her father, Michael Wallace, and her stepfather, David Castor. The note stated that she had harmed both men and could not live with the guilt. The word antifreeze appeared 4 times in the note. It was spelled anti-free each time, without the letter Z. When Ashley recovered in hospital and investigators came to speak with her, she told them she had no idea what the note was talking about. She had not written it. She had not tried to end her life. She had not harmed her father or her stepfather. She told investigators they needed to talk to her mother. A search of the computer in Stacey Castor's home established that the suicide note had been typed on that machine. The note had been composed on Stacey's home computer and presented alongside her unconscious daughter as a confession. Forensic linguistic analysis was also conducted. The language patterns, phrasing, and specific word choices in the note were examined and compared with Stacey's own writing style in known documents. Investigators also established what had actually happened to Ashley. Stacey had invited her daughter home. Ashley had recently been visited at her college by investigators asking questions about the circumstances of David Castor's passing, and she had called her mother in distress. Stacey had responded by suggesting they have a drink together because they had both had a difficult week. Ashley recalled thinking this was a surprisingly good offer from her mother. What teenager would turn down their parent offering them permission to drink? The first drink Stacey prepared put Ashley to sleep. She passed out and woke up the next day in her bedroom. She drank with her mother again. Over a period of approximately 17 hours, according to prosecutors, Stacey used a teaspoon to feed Ashley a mixture of vodka and crushed prescription pills while she was increasingly incapacitated. The combination of alcohol and the volume of sedatives nearly took Ashley's life. Ashley survived. Stacey Castor was arrested at the hospital. She was charged with second-degree taking of a life for David Castor's passing, second-degree attempted taking of a life for the attack on Ashley Wallace, and forgery for filing a fake copy of David Castor's will in order to inherit his estate. The trial took place in early 2009. The jury of 10 women and 2 men heard 5 weeks of evidence. Ashley Wallace testified against her mother, a moment that the courtroom absorbed in near silence. The prosecution presented the fingerprint evidence from the antifreeze glass, the turkey baster with David's DNA and ethylene glycol, the slip of the tongue in the police interview, the computer records establishing where the suicide note had been created, and the forensic linguistic analysis. Stacey's defense team argued that Ashley was responsible for David Castor's passing and had indeed attempted to end her own life, positioning Stacey as a grieving mother who had been set up by her own daughter. The jury deliberated for 16 hours across 4 days. On February 5, 2009, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: second-degree taking of a life, attempted second-degree taking of a life, and forgery. The sentencing hearing was held on March 5, 2009. Onondaga County Judge Joseph Fahey sentenced Stacey Castor to the maximum on the primary charge, 25 years to life for David Castor's passing. He sentenced her to another 25 years to life for the attempted taking of Ashley's life. He added an additional 1 1/3 to 4 years for the forgery. The total minimum before any parole eligibility was 51 years and 4 months. Before passing sentence, Judge Fahey addressed Stacey directly in open court. He told her that in 34 years working in the criminal justice system as both a lawyer and a judge, he had seen every variety of person who takes a life: serial offenders, hired hands, every type. He told her she was in a class by herself. He said he had never seen a parent willing to sacrifice their own child to shift blame away from themselves. Ashley Wallace spoke at the sentencing as well. She told the court she hated her mother for what she had done, not just for what had been done to her personally, but for ruining so many people's lives. Stacey Castor maintained her innocence throughout. In a television interview in 2009, she told a reporter that she would die for her kids, that she could never hurt them, that her kids were her life. District Attorney William Fitzpatrick, who prosecuted the case, told reporters after sentencing that given Stacey's age at the time, 41, it was very likely she would pass away in prison before becoming eligible for parole. He was correct. Stacey Castor passed away on June 11, 2016, at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Westchester County. She was 48 years old. The cause of her passing was not publicly specified. She was still serving her sentence. Stacey was never charged in the passing of Michael Wallace. The exhumation confirmed homicide by antifreeze ingestion, and prosecutors presented the evidence of his passing at trial to establish a pattern. But because she had not been charged, and because the statute of limitations in New York does not apply to taking of a life, the question of whether a charge would have been filed if she had lived remained open. The practical answer was that the trial already addressed what had happened. The jury heard the evidence about Michael Wallace, understood what it meant, and it formed part of the evidentiary foundation for the conviction. Michael Wallace was 38 years old when he passed away, leaving behind 2 young daughters who were told their father had suffered a heart attack. He had spent months feeling drunk without drinking anything, unable to understand what was happening to his own body, while the person living with him knew exactly what was causing it. David Castor was 48. His son David Jr. was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Ashley Wallace was 20 years old when her mother poured drinks for her, and slowly, over 17 hours, filled them with enough sedative and alcohol to nearly take her life, while simultaneously having typed a document on the home computer declaring that Ashley had been responsible for 2 takings of life and was ending her life out of guilt. The case is featured in a Forensic Files episode. The district attorney later noted in an interview that it had everything a forensic evidence-driven prosecution could ask for: computer evidence, DNA evidence, forensic linguistic analysis, and a verbal slip in a police interview that no innocent person could credibly explain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final 2 cases in this video cover women who operated at the furthest edges of what this pattern looks like. One in the United States at the turn of the millennium, where a group of young people sat around a restaurant table and decided that a set of parents needed to disappear, and one that stretches back over a century to a courtroom in France, where the verdict produced one of the most unusual and debated legal aftermaths in European criminal history. Section 9. Margaret Branch, 6 years of inheritance war that left 2 people dead. DeKalb County, Georgia sits just east of Atlanta. Stone Mountain, one of its communities, is a mid-sized suburban area with neighborhoods of average houses, strip malls, and churches. It is not the kind of place that produces headline crimes regularly. The Fuss family changed that. The story of what happened in DeKalb County over roughly 6 years, from 1993 to 1999, is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of what an inheritance dispute can produce when every restraining factor is removed and the people involved have neither the legal grounding nor the emotional capacity to resolve conflict through any means other than escalation. It produced 2 bodies. It involved incest discovered by accident. It ended with multiple convictions. And at the centre of it, consistently, was one woman, Margaret, the only biological daughter of Bill and Jackie Fuss. Bill Fuss built a modest financial life over his working years. By the time he passed away in 1993, he and his wife Jackie had accumulated assets worth close to $500,000. The family home, several rental properties they owned, approximately $134,000 in cash and certificates of deposit, Jackie's jewellery collection, which included more than 50 diamond rings and was valued at around $100,000, and 9 cars. For a working family in suburban Georgia, this was a substantial estate. Bill and Jackie had 4 children. Margaret was their only biological child. David, Charles and Melissa were all adopted at different points during the marriage. Margaret was the oldest. She had grown up as an only child before the adoptions began, and by multiple accounts from people who knew the family, she never fully accepted the additions. Friends and family later told investigators and reporters that Margaret had routinely told the 3 adopted siblings they were not real members of the family, that Bill and Jackie were her parents, not theirs, that the biological connection gave her a different and superior claim to everything the family had. When Bill Fuss passed away in 1993, all 4 adult children came home expecting that the estate would be distributed. Jackie had other ideas. She chose not to divide anything immediately. The money and the assets stayed with Jackie. Her reasoning, according to her son David, was that she intended to use the funds to support Charles, the adopted son who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and required constant medication and supervision to function safely. As long as Jackie was alive and managing the finances, Charles could be taken care of. The other 3 siblings, particularly Margaret, did not receive this news well. Every sibling hired lawyers. The legal disputes over Bill Fuss's estate began almost immediately and continued for years, grinding through the court system, while Jackie remained in the middle, holding everything together by sheer force of presence. Retired DeKalb County Detective Brian Harris, who later spoke about the case, described Jackie's role in the family dynamic precisely. As long as she was alive, she kept the lid on the pot. When the lid was removed, there was nothing left to keep the fire from spreading. The lid was removed on June 21, 1996. That morning, police responded to a welfare check at the Fuss family home. Inside, in the bedroom belonging to Charles, they found Jackie Fuss. She was 72 years old and had been struck in the head with an axe. Charles, who had been living with his mother since Bill's passing, and whose mental illness had been worsening without consistent treatment, had hidden the axe under his bed and waited for his mother to come look for something beneath it. When she knelt down, he retrieved the axe and delivered a fatal blow to the back of her head. He then wiped the axe clean, returned it to where he had found it, emptied his mother's purse of cash, and took a taxi to a bar. He later tried to hitchhike to California, but only made it as far as Arkansas before turning himself in to police. A Georgia court found him guilty but mentally ill at trial in December 1997 and sent him to a state mental health facility. Charles Fuss spent the remainder of his life in institutional custody. What happened within hours of Jackie's body being discovered tells you everything you need to know about what the inheritance dispute had done to this family. According to a contemporaneous report in the Atlanta Constitution newspaper, within hours of Jackie's passing becoming known, Melissa petitioned the court to have her mother's 3 safe deposit boxes opened. Before funeral flowers had even been arranged, the 3 remaining siblings, Margaret, David, and Melissa, met at a restaurant to discuss how to divide the estate. The same article noted their apparent lack of concern about the fact that their mother had just been taken from this world and that their mentally ill brother was facing life in a state institution. Margaret's position in those early conversations was unmistakable. She was very adamant, according to multiple people present, that as the only biological child of Jackie and Bill, the entire inheritance belonged to her alone. The adopted siblings were not real heirs. The money was hers. She was named administrator of Jackie's estate because Jackie had left no will, a designation that gave her enormous practical control over the assets. The court disputes intensified. All siblings had lawyers. Margaret refused to split the estate 3 ways. David, now married to a woman named Kelly Fuss, was accused by Margaret and Melissa of having stolen jewellery and other items from Jackie's property. David denied taking anything. Nobody could prove anything either way. The legal battle stretched across years, consuming legal fees and generating the kind of family bitterness that tends to crystallise into permanent positions rather than resolve itself. By June 1999, the estate fight had been running for 3 years since Jackie's passing and 6 years since Bill's. Nothing had been resolved. The siblings were in active litigation against each other. David and Kelly Fuss lived in a house in Stone Mountain. David's wife, Kelly, 31 years old, had been dragged into a dispute she had not chosen, married into a family whose internal dynamics were already catastrophically broken when she arrived. A friend of Kelly's later told reporters that Kelly had not had a good relationship with her in-laws and was completely frustrated by the years of ongoing conflict. She had not chosen Margaret or Melissa as family members. She had chosen David. On the morning of June 15, 1999, Margaret Branch called David and asked him to come to their deceased mother's house to discuss the inheritance situation. David agreed and left his home at approximately 9 in the morning. Kelly stayed home. What David did not know was that Margaret had no intention of meeting him there. The call was a lure. Its purpose was to get David out of the house. While David drove to a meeting that was never going to happen, Margaret, Melissa Erives, and Melissa's boyfriend Joel Dominguez drove in Melissa's white pickup truck to David and Kelly's house in Stone Mountain. Margaret entered the house. This is confirmed by the Georgia Supreme Court record in the Dominguez versus State appeal. Dominguez entered approximately 15 minutes later. What happened inside the house during those minutes produced a crime scene that retired Detective Brian Harris, a veteran of DeKalb County law enforcement, later described as the most intensely bloody he had ever encountered in a career that had included many serious crime scenes. Kelly Fuss was in the bathroom when the first encounter happened, according to Detective Chris Harvey, who also worked the case. The evidence indicated she fought hard. The struggle moved from the bathroom down the hallway toward the kitchen, where Kelly ultimately fell. She had been stabbed and cut 30 times. 2 of the wounds were fatal. There were defensive injuries on her arms. She had fought against her attacker until she could not fight anymore. Blood covered the kitchen. Blood spatter was on the walls. The phone line in the house had been cut. When David returned home, he found Kelly on the kitchen floor and could not call for help because the line was severed. He went outside and waited for police to arrive. He was 31 years old. He immediately told officers he believed his sisters were responsible. Witnesses near the scene had seen Kelly's Mustang being driven away from the area and then parked several blocks from the house. They saw a man get out of the Mustang and get into the back of a white pickup truck driven by 2 women. The man covered himself with a blanket in the back of the truck. The pickup truck was eventually located at the Fuss family property. Inside were Melissa Erives and Joel Dominguez. The Georgia Supreme Court record confirms that after Dominguez got into the truck, Margaret also got in, and they drove away together. Dominguez had driven Kelly's car away from the scene and abandoned it. Dominguez was arrested. Blood was found on his sock that tested positive for Kelly Fuss's blood. The investigation also surfaced something that had nothing to do with the inheritance dispute, but that became one of the most widely reported aspects of the entire case. Melissa Erives and Joel Dominguez had been in a romantic relationship. After they began dating, both discovered that they were biological siblings. Melissa had been adopted as a child, and Dominguez turned out to be her biological brother. The odds of 2 people who did not grow up together discovering this after entering a relationship were cited by investigators as approximately 1 in 2 million. Charges related to this were brought in a neighbouring county, but were ultimately not pursued because the homicide charges took legal precedence. Detective Harris summarised the situation in a phrase that became one of the most quoted descriptions of the case. Kelly Fuss had married into an exceptionally dysfunctional family. All 3, Margaret Branch, Melissa Erives, and Joel Dominguez, were charged with the taking of a life and burglary. In September 2000, Margaret Branch and Melissa Erives each accepted plea agreements. Both received 10-year sentences. Both were released from custody in 2009. Joel Dominguez did not accept a plea. His trial began in March 2001. As part of her agreement, Melissa testified against him. The Georgia Supreme Court, in its 2003 ruling on Dominguez's appeal, confirmed the core facts of what had happened. Branch had made the call to lure David away. Branch had entered the house first. Dominguez had entered approximately 15 minutes later, and after Kelly's passing, the group had driven away together. The court affirmed Dominguez's conviction. He was found responsible for the taking of Kelly Fuss's life and sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 20 years. In February 2018, he was found dead in his prison cell in what was ruled an apparent suicide. Margaret Branch was released from prison in 2009 after serving her 10-year sentence. The estate of Bill and Jackie Fuss, the $500,000 in assets, the jewellery, the rental properties, the 9 cars, was the ignition point for everything that happened. Not the direct cause in a simple sense, because the family's dysfunction predated the money and would likely have expressed itself through some other mechanism. But the inheritance was the specific thing that organised the conflict. It gave shape to grievances that had existed since Margaret was a child, watching her parents bring home children she never wanted as siblings. It gave her a legal framework for the claim she had always believed was hers. And when the legal system failed to give her what she felt she was owed, something else took over. There is a detail in this case that does not appear in most accounts, but sits in the original court documentation. After Jackie's passing in 1996, Margaret was named estate administrator because there was no will. That designation gave her formal control over the process of managing and distributing what Jackie had left behind. She used that position not to resolve the dispute, but to advance her own claim. The court battles that followed consumed resources that could have gone to the remaining family members and left everyone in an increasingly bitter stalemate. Kelly Fuss had nothing to do with any of it. She was married to David. She had her own life, her own relationships, her own plans. She is described by people who knew her as someone who had tried to stay out of the inheritance conflict, but could not fully escape it because it surrounded her husband. The morning of June 15, 1999, she was home while David drove to a meeting that was always a trap. She put up a fight that was documented in the physical evidence of her own home. It was not enough. The case was covered by the Oxygen Network's Fatal Family Feuds program, which documented the DeKalb County detective interviews and reconstruction of the events. The Georgia Supreme Court ruling in the Dominguez appeal is a matter of public record and provides the verified factual framework for the sequence of events on June 15, 1999. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this video is the one that, in many ways, started everything else. It is almost a century older than the others. It happened in Paris. It involves a woman who was condemned to death, saw that sentence reversed multiple times over decades, rebuilt her life completely afterward, and whose case is still discussed and debated in French academic and cultural circles today. What it shares with every case in this video is the same foundation: someone who needed money, a family member who had it, and a decision that could not be undone. Section 10. Stacey Caster. 2 husbands, 1 daughter, and a note that did not add up. Weedsport is a small village in Cayuga County in central New York, about 25 miles west of Syracuse. A few thousand residents, a main street, farmland pressing in from all sides, and the kind of quiet where unusual events register quickly. Stacey Ruth Daniels grew up in nearby Clay, New York. She was born on July 24, 1967, and by the time she was 17, she had already met the man who would become her first husband, Michael Wallace. They married in 1988 when she was 21. 2 daughters arrived, Ashley in 1987 and Bree in 1991. The family had limited finances and an unremarkable life, visible from the outside as nothing more than 2 young parents trying to manage a household on modest income in a small town. In the final months of 1999, Michael Wallace began getting sick in ways that nobody around him could explain or identify. He was dizzy and unstable on his feet. He could barely walk or put sentences together clearly. He told his doctors on multiple visits that he felt the way a person feels after drinking too much alcohol. That heavy, off-balance, slow-motion feeling where the world seems slightly out of reach. But he had not been drinking anything. Doctors ran tests, admitted him for observation, and came up with no explanation for what was causing him to deteriorate. His family watched him decline through the autumn and into the holiday season. Ashley Wallace, his older daughter, was 12 years old at the time. She later recalled watching her father sit up suddenly from the couch, vomit across the coffee table, and lie back down as though nothing had happened. He was a man who had been healthy. He had no obvious chronic conditions. There was no explanation that made sense, and the people who lived with him knew it. 3 months before he passed away, Michael had told his doctor specifically that he felt intoxicated without having consumed any alcohol. That detail was documented in his medical records. At the time, it went unexplained. Michael Wallace passed away on January 11, 2000. He was 38 years old. The official cause of death recorded at the time was a heart attack. His family had doubts from the start. His sister pushed immediately for an autopsy and was refused. Stacey told the family that the doctors had made their determination and there was no reason to question medical professionals. Michael Wallace was buried in Cayuga County without an autopsy being performed. His sister's request went unanswered. His daughters grew up understanding their father had died of a heart attack at 38. Stacey collected his life insurance policy. The payout was $55,000. 3 years after Michael's passing in 2003, Stacey married for the second time. Her new husband was David Castor, 48 years old at the time of their wedding. David owned an air conditioning installation and repair business in central New York. He had campers, motorcycles, jet skis, snowmobiles, a house, and a business worth substantial consideration. He also had a son from a previous relationship named David Castor Jr., with whom David had recently reconciled after a period of estrangement. Stacey worked as the office manager of David's business, which put her in close contact with his financial affairs and records. They lived together in their home in the Syracuse area. From outside, the picture was one of two people who had each had a difficult first marriage and had found something more stable the second time around. On August 22, 2005, Stacey called 911. She told the dispatcher she was worried about her husband and that he had been locked in the bedroom for about a day without coming out. Officers and paramedics arrived. Stacey asked them to break down the locked bedroom door. They found David Castor dead in the bed. On the nightstand beside him sat a glass containing a green liquid. A jug of antifreeze was on the floor nearby. The medical examiner confirmed that David had died from ingesting ethylene glycol, the active toxic compound in automotive antifreeze. Ethylene glycol has a mild sweet taste that can be concealed in other beverages, and it causes a specific, progressive deterioration of the body's organs over hours when consumed in sufficient quantity. It is an uncomfortable, drawn-out way to pass away. The initial ruling on David Castor's death was suicide. The scene had been arranged to suggest that a depressed man had chosen to end his own life by drinking the toxic liquid on the floor beside him. Investigators worked through the physical evidence and encountered problems quickly. The first was the glass on the nightstand. 3 fingerprints were found on it. All 3 belonged to Stacey Castor. Not one fingerprint on that glass belonged to David. Lead investigator Detective Dominic Spinelli later described the positioning of Stacey's fingerprints as notable. They were placed at the bottom of the glass in a way consistent with someone holding the glass up to another person's mouth, rather than with someone picking up a glass to drink from themselves. Spinelli acknowledged this could have an innocent explanation, but found it worth examining carefully alongside everything else. The second problem was a turkey baster found in the kitchen. It contained traces of ethylene glycol, together with David's DNA on its tip. Investigators formed a detailed picture from these 2 items together. David had likely been given the antifreeze mixed into something else, something he would not have recognised immediately, until he became incapacitated enough to lose the ability to resist. The turkey baster had then been used to force additional amounts of the poison directly into his throat. This is a specific and deliberate method of delivering a substance to someone who cannot stop you. A third observation mattered considerably. The Castor home had a gun in it. If someone had wanted to stage a convincing suicide, a firearm would have been a far more immediate and plausible method than the prolonged ingestion of antifreeze. The choice of poison as both the actual and staged method made the suicide framing difficult to defend under scrutiny. Stacey's explanation of events also changed across conversations with police. In her earliest statements, she suggested David had been depressed about losing his father recently and had chosen to end his life. In later accounts, she offered a different version. The couple had argued over their anniversary vacation. David typically closed his business every August for 2 weeks, and that year wanted just the 2 of them to travel alone. Stacey had not wanted to be away that long because their daughter Bree was 14, and she did not want to leave her for an extended period. In this version, David had become so enraged by the disagreement that he grabbed a bottle of Southern Comfort, locked himself in the bedroom, and did not come out. The difficulty with this version was physical. There was no Southern Comfort on the nightstand. The bottle present was apricot brandy. Details that shift and facts that fail to match physical evidence are among the things investigators document carefully. During a police interview about David's passing, Stacy produced a verbal slip that became one of the most cited moments in the entire case. She was talking through the evening and said aloud that she had poured him the antifreeze, and then caught herself mid-word and substituted cranberry juice. Investigators immediately drew her attention to what she had said. She told them they had misheard her or confused her words. When investigators produced a photograph of the turkey baster during the same session, she ended the interview without further explanation and declined to continue. The case was reclassified as a homicide. Prosecutors also examined the will that had been submitted following David's passing. The document left his entire estate, valued at approximately $300,000, including the business, the property, and the various vehicles and recreational equipment he had accumulated, entirely to Stacy and her 2 daughters. David Custer Jr. was cut out of it completely, despite the fact that David Sr. and his son had recently reconciled after years of estrangement. When investigators analysed the document, they determined it was a forgery. A charge of forgery was added to the case. Investigators next turned their attention to Michael Wallace. He had been buried without an autopsy in Cayuga County, a different legal jurisdiction from the Onondaga County investigation. Obtaining legal permission to exhume his body required coordination between 2 separate county systems and took nearly a full year. The exhumation was conducted in September 2007. Investigators deliberately kept it secret from Stacy, so she would have no opportunity to interfere with the process. When forensic pathologists examined Michael Wallace's remains, they found the chemical signature they had been looking for. Antifreeze poisoning leaves crystalline deposits of calcium oxalate in human tissue, a marker that persists in the body for years after passing. Michael Wallace, buried for 7 years as a heart attack victim, had those crystals in his remains. His cause of death was reclassified as homicide by ethylene glycol ingestion. 2 husbands, the same substance, 7 years apart. Stacy's refusal to allow an autopsy in January 2000 had been the single act that kept all of this buried for nearly a decade. Without that exhumation, Michael Wallace would have remained a heart attack victim in the official record indefinitely. Within days of the exhumation results being confirmed, while investigators were still working through the implications of what they had found, Stacy made another 911 call. She told the dispatcher that her daughter had taken some pills. Ashley Wallace, Stacy's older daughter and Michael's child, was found unconscious at the family home. She was 20 years old. Emergency services transported her to hospital in serious condition. Alongside her unconscious body, investigators discovered a typed document written in the first person. In it, Ashley confessed to having arranged the passings of her father Michael Wallace and her stepfather David Custer. It stated she had been responsible for both men's deaths and could no longer live with the weight of what she had done. The word antifreeze appeared 4 times across that 750-word document. Each time, it was spelled antifreeze, the letter Z absent every single time. When Ashley recovered in hospital and could speak clearly, she told investigators she had no understanding of what the note was talking about. She had not written it. She had not attempted to end her own life. She had not caused the deaths of either her father or her stepfather. She told investigators to speak with her mother. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Stacy's home computer. The analysis confirmed that the note had been composed on that machine and that multiple drafts of the document existed in the system. It had been written, revised, and finalised before being printed. The final version sat at 750 words. Forensic linguistic analysis was also carried out, comparing the note's specific phrasing, word choices, and sentence patterns with Stacy's own documented writing from other sources. The analysis pointed towards Stacy as the document's author. The full account of what had actually happened to Ashley was established through medical evidence, toxicology results, and Ashley's own testimony. Investigators learned that Stacy had invited Ashley home after Ashley mentioned that investigators had come to her college to ask questions about David Custer's passing. Ashley was unsettled by these visits and called her mother. Stacy suggested they spend the evening together and have some drinks because it had been a rough period for both of them. To Ashley, this offer carried no suspicion. Her mother was extending an invitation to unwind together. She accepted. The first drink Stacy prepared put Ashley to sleep. She woke up the following day in her bedroom, assuming she had simply drunk more than she could handle. Stacy invited her to drink again the next day. Over approximately 17 hours, according to the prosecution at trial, Stacey administered a progressively increasing mixture of vodka and crushed prescription pills using a teaspoon, while her daughter became less and less able to function or resist. The volume of sedative medication, combined with the alcohol over that extended window, came close to ending Ashley's life. She was found unconscious by her younger sister Bree and taken to hospital in time to survive. Had Bree not found her when she did, the document on the computer would have been the version of events that stood. Stacey was arrested at the hospital. The 3 charges filed were second-degree taking of a life for David Castor's passing, second-degree attempted taking of a life for what had been done to Ashley, and forgery for the falsified will. Stacey was not charged separately for Michael Wallace's passing, though the statute of limitations on homicide does not exist under New York law, and charges could theoretically have been brought. Prosecutors made the tactical decision to use the full evidence of Michael's death throughout the trial as proof of an established pattern. The jury heard the complete story of both husbands. The trial ran in early 2009 in Onondaga County for approximately 5 weeks. 50 witnesses testified in total. Ashley Wallace took the stand against her own mother and described in detail the strange taste of the drinks her mother had prepared for her, waking up confused in her bedroom not knowing what had happened, recovering in hospital, and learning that a 750-word document had been composed on a home computer and printed with her name as the author, confessing to 2 deaths she had never caused. Her younger sister Bree also testified on behalf of the prosecution. Both of Stacey's daughters testified against her. The evidence stacked in connected layers. Stacey's fingerprints were on the glass and nobody else's. David's DNA was on the turkey baster alongside the ethylene glycol. The verbal slip in the police interview was in the recorded transcript and documented in writing. Multiple drafts of the typed note were recoverable from the computer's storage. The forensic linguistic analysis pointed to one author. The exhumation connected the first passing to the second through identical chemical means across 7 years. Every piece of evidence pointed the same direction as every other piece. Stacey testified in her own defense and maintained her innocence. She told the court she would have given her life for her daughters. Her defense attorney argued that Ashley had been responsible for David Castor's passing and had genuinely attempted to end her own life out of guilt. That Stacey was a grieving mother, being falsely accused and set up by her own child. The jury heard this argument for 5 weeks. On February 5, 2009, after 16 hours of deliberation spread over 4 days, the jury returned its verdicts. Guilty on second-degree taking of a life. Guilty on attempted second-degree taking of a life. Guilty on forgery. Sentencing took place on March 5, 2009, before Onondaga County Judge Joseph Fahey. He sentenced Stacey to 25 years to life on the primary charge for David Castor's passing. He sentenced her to another 25 years to life for the attempt on Ashley's life. He added 1 year and 4 months to 4 years for the forgery charge. The total minimum before any parole eligibility came to 51 years and 4 months. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Fahey addressed Stacey directly from the bench. He told her that in 34 years in the criminal justice system, working first as a lawyer and then as a judge, he had encountered every category of person who takes a life. Those who act alone, those who hire others, those who act repeatedly. He told her she was in a class entirely by herself. The observation was not rhetorical. It was the considered judgment of a judge who had spent 3.5 decades in courtrooms. He said specifically that in his entire career, he had never seen a parent willing to sacrifice their own child to redirect blame away from themselves. District Attorney William Fitzpatrick, who prosecuted the case, described it to reporters after sentencing as a prosecutor's near ideal in terms of forensic completeness. Computer evidence, DNA evidence, forensic linguistic analysis, a verbal slip documented in a police interview transcript, a fingerprint pattern placing Stacey physically at the centre of the act. Every category of evidence confirmed what every other category confirmed. He said that in light of her age at sentencing, 41, it was very likely she would pass away in prison before becoming eligible for parole. He was correct. Ashley Wallace also addressed the court at sentencing. She told the judge she hated her mother for what she had done, not only for what had been done to her personally, but for the destruction spread across so many lives across so many years. She did not elaborate further than that. She did not need to. The court record did it for her. Both of her daughters had stood in the same courtroom and spoken against the woman who raised them, because that was what the evidence required, and because, for Ashley especially, no other version of events was available to tell. Stacey maintained through every subsequent interview and statement that she was innocent. In a television interview conducted that same year, she said she could never hurt her children, that she would die for them, that they were her life. Stacey Castor passed away at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Westchester County, New York, on June 11, 2016. She was 48 years old. The cause of her passing was not publicly disclosed. She died having served 7 years of a sentence requiring a minimum of 51, having never been charged for Michael Wallace's death, and having maintained her innocence until the end. Michael Wallace was 38 years old when he passed away on January 11, 2000, after months of unexplained deterioration that his doctors could not identify while it was happening. He had 2 young daughters. They were told he died of a heart attack. His sister wanted an autopsy. Stacey refused. David Castor was 48. He had a son who discovered through a forged document that he had been excluded entirely from his father's estate, despite the reconciliation they had achieved before David Sr. died. David Castor Jr. sat in the Onondaga County courtroom in 2009 and heard the verdict returned. Ashley Wallace was 20 years old when her mother spent 17 hours using a teaspoon to feed her a mixture of sedatives and alcohol, then sat at a home computer and composed a 750-word confession in her daughter's name, describing 2 passings Ashley had never caused. She survived, she testified, she told the court the truth. The case was covered in a Forensic Files episode. It has been the subject of multiple documentaries and true crime broadcasts. The forensic and legal record of it is comprehensive and public. 10 cases across this video span 6 decades and 5 countries. They involve women of widely different ages and circumstances, passings that happened in seconds and ones that unfolded over years, acts carried out alone and acts that required coordination between multiple people. What connects every single one of them is not the method or the country or the sum of money involved. It is simpler than any of those variables. In each case, someone looked at a family member and made the decision that the money attached to that person's existence was worth more than the person themselves. That specific decision, wherever it was made and however it was carried out, had the same result every time. These 10 cases are different in every visible way. The logic underneath them is not different at all. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.